On March 31st, 1905, the streets of Tangier became the stage for a moment that reverberated across Europe. The German imperial yacht Hohenzollern had anchored in the Moroccan port, and Kaiser Wilhelm II, wearing a white parade uniform and flanked by a carefully chosen retinue, disembarked to the sound of Moroccan guards presenting arms. What might have passed for a ceremonial visit quickly became something else entirely. In front of local dignitaries, foreign observers, and an assembled crowd, Wilhelm declared his recognition of Sultan Abdelaziz as the sovereign of a free and independent Morocco. The phrasing was deliberate. It was not a casual endorsement, but a direct rebuke to French ambitions, which since 1904 had been steadily consolidating into a policy of protectorate control. Wilhelm's words were carefully orchestrated in Berlin by Chancellor Bernhard von Bülow and Foreign Secretary Oswald von Richthofen. The Kaiser's speech was not improvised, though his theatrical gestures gave it the air of spontaneity. In essence, Germany was announcing to Europe that France could not simply extend its colonial frontier from Algeria into Morocco without challenge. Morocco, though formally independent, had become a prize that Paris regarded as the natural extension of its North African empire. The Entente Cordiale signed the previous year with Britain had tacitly recognized this sphere of influence. To Germany, excluded from the arrangement, the symbolism of Tangier was intolerable. The German move was calculated to destabilize the new Anglo-French understanding. By staging the visit in Tangier, rather than through diplomatic channels in Paris or London, Berlin sought maximum theatrical effect. Foreign journalists had been tipped off. The Kaiser's speech was reported across European capitals within hours. In London, the Times printed the words in full, noting their unmistakable challenge. In Paris, the press reacted with indignation, describing the performance as an affront to French dignity. Even in Washington, the State Department requested clarification from its embassy in Berlin as to whether this signaled an impending military clash. The Moroccan Sultan Abdelaziz, then only in his early 20s, stood awkwardly at the center of this unfolding drama. His court had little choice but to receive the German emperor with the honors due a head of state. For him, the German recognition of his sovereignty was welcome in theory, but it immediately exposed him to the ire of France, whose armies already encircled Morocco from Algeria and Tunisia. His own authority within Morocco was fragile, contested by tribal leaders and urban notables alike. The German intervention was less a guarantee of independence than an invitation for further entanglement in European rivalries. For France, the shock lay not only in the speech but in its timing. Théophile Delcasse, the French foreign minister, had been building a policy of firmness. Morocco, like Tunisia before it, would fall under Paris's sway by steady pressure and incremental reform. The Entente Cordiale of April 1904 had cemented British acceptance of this policy in return for French acquiescence in Egypt. The system appeared stable, with Spain also allocated minor coastal rights. Suddenly, Wilhelm's declaration had exposed France's Moroccan project to international dispute. In Berlin, the reaction was triumphant. Von Bülow described the Tangier visit as a masterstroke, intended to force a diplomatic showdown. Germany would insist that the Moroccan question was a matter for all powers, not a bilateral settlement between France and Britain. If Paris resisted, Berlin could portray France as arrogant and unilateral. If Paris conceded, Germany would prove that the Entente was hollow, that Britain would not risk confrontation over what appeared to be a colonial matter on the North African coast. The maneuver was not merely about Morocco itself, but about testing the solidity of the new diplomatic architecture taking shape in Europe. The European public, however, read the incident less abstractly. In France, crowds gathered outside newspaper offices demanding that Delcasse defend national honor. In Germany, the press praised Wilhelm's courage in challenging French pretensions. In Britain, commentators warned that German interference threatened the stability of the Mediterranean. In Vienna, the Austrian press cautiously welcomed Berlin's boldness, while in Rome the Italian government expressed unease at being drawn into a quarrel that offered little benefit to Italy's interests. The military dimension lurked behind every discussion. Though no mobilizations were ordered in April 1905, both France and Germany began quiet staff consultations. The French General Staff considered contingency plans for reinforcing Algeria should war erupt. The German General Staff, under Alfred von Schlieffen, noted the opportunity that a French colonial distraction might present for operations in Europe. While neither government desired war at that moment, the crisis injected a new volatility into strategic planning. Edward VII of Britain, watching events from London, immediately grasped their significance. His policy since ascending the throne had been to rebuild relations with France, strained for centuries by colonial rivalry. The Entente Cordiale was his personal achievement, supported by Foreign Secretary Lord Lansdowne. Wilhelm's intervention threatened not only French colonial aims, but the broader British strategy of balancing against German power. For the king, Tangier was not a distant spectacle, but a direct challenge to his diplomacy. Thus, within a single day, what began as a theatrical landing by an emperor in a Moroccan port had escalated into a European crisis. Wilhelm's white uniform, his parade through Tangier's narrow streets, his public endorsement of a vulnerable sultan, all were stagecraft designed to unsettle. Yet beneath the theater lay real calculations of power, alliances, and war. The spark had been struck, and though the flames did not yet leap across the continent, every capital in Europe watched closely. The Moroccan question was no longer a regional matter, but a test of the new balance of power. The significance of Morocco in 1905 was not measured solely by its apparent poverty or its fragmented politics, but by its geography. Stretching along the Atlantic and Mediterranean, it occupied the western extremity of North Africa, commanding the Straits of Gibraltar, and thus one of the world's most strategic maritime choke points. Whoever influenced Morocco could affect the approaches to the Mediterranean, a region through which Britain's imperial lifeline to India and the East passed. For France, Morocco represented the missing link in a chain of North African possessions already extending across Algeria and Tunisia. For Germany, Morocco was a lever, not a colonial objective in itself, but a pressure point that could destabilize French expansion and reveal the fragility of the new Anglo-French understanding. French involvement in Morocco had grown steadily since the mid-19th century. France had already secured Algeria through conquest beginning in the 1830s, and by the 1880s its hold was firm, supported by hundreds of thousands of settlers and a large garrison. In 1881, the establishment of a protectorate over Tunisia, carried out with little warning to Italy, had consolidated France's reach further east. That left Morocco as the last independent state in the Maghreb, and French diplomats, soldiers, and financiers increasingly turned their attention westward. Reports circulated in Paris that Moroccan markets could be opened, railways constructed, and French settlers encouraged, all under the guise of reform. The Moroccan state itself, however, was weak and divided. Sultan Abdelaziz had inherited the throne in 1894 at the age of 16, after the death of his father, Hassan I. His reign was characterized by attempts to modernize the administration and introduce European-style reforms, including the purchase of telegraph lines and modern weapons. Yet these measures were financed by foreign loans, leaving the Moroccan treasury dependent on European bankers. By the turn of the century, French creditors dominated Moroccan finance, further entangling the country's sovereignty with Paris. Tribal revolts erupted periodically, undermining the Sultan's authority beyond the coastal cities. To European observers, Morocco was a failing state whose weakness justified intervention. France's designs were formalized in the Entente Cordiale of April 1904. In a series of secret clauses, Britain agreed to recognize Morocco as lying within the French sphere of influence, in return for French acknowledgement of Britain's dominance in Egypt. The arrangement extended to Spain as well, which was promised control over small northern enclaves. In diplomatic language, the agreements promised only consultation and cooperation, but the substance was unmistakable. Morocco was to become a French protectorate in all but name. For Germany, this represented a strategic setback. Berlin had been deliberately excluded from the negotiations leading to the Entente Cordiale. Kaiser Wilhelm II had long harbored ambitions for German colonial expansion, though in practice the German overseas empire was limited in scope compared with Britain or France. In Africa, Germany possessed colonies in Southwest Africa, Cameroon, Togoland, and East Africa, but these holdings were scattered and less economically developed. Morocco, rich in phosphates, iron ore, and agricultural potential, was not simply another colony. It was a test case for whether Germany could block the consolidation of rival empires and insert itself into the decision-making process. Chancellor von Bülow articulated the German position with clarity in the Reichstag in December 1904. He insisted that Germany sought no annexation in Morocco, but would not tolerate any arrangement excluding German commerce. The open-door principle, the idea that all powers should have equal access to trade, became Berlin's official stance. Behind the language of free commerce, however, lay the deeper objective of challenging the Entente itself. If France and Britain could coordinate policy without consulting Germany, then Berlin risked becoming isolated. Morocco's own government was caught in the crossfire. Sultan Abdelaziz, though young and inexperienced, attempted to balance the pressures. He accepted French loans and advisors, but he also courted other powers, including Germany and Britain, in an effort to preserve independence. His court in Fez was a battleground of factions, with traditionalist notables opposing reformist officials who favored closer ties with Europe. In 1905, as Wilhelm landed at Tangier, Abdelaziz was both flattered by German recognition and alarmed by the prospect of antagonizing France. His position was unenviable. Morocco's sovereignty was invoked by outsiders, but compromised at every step. The commercial stakes were not negligible. French merchants already dominated trade in the coastal ports, particularly Casablanca and Rabat, exporting grain, wool, and leather to European markets. German firms, though fewer in number, pressed for equal rights. French railway companies proposed ambitious projects linking the interior to the coast, plans that would cement French control over Moroccan territory. For Britain, the overriding concern was less commercial than strategic. The Straits of Gibraltar must not fall under unfriendly influence. So long as France, a partner in the Entente, predominated, British interests were safe. If Germany managed to gain leverage in Morocco, however, the situation at Gibraltar and the Mediterranean could be compromised. The broader European context magnified these stakes. The turn of the century had seen an accelerating rivalry between Britain and Germany, particularly at sea, where the German naval program threatened British supremacy. France, still resentful over the loss of Alsace-Lorraine in 1871, regarded Germany as its primary enemy in Europe. Russia, defeated by Japan in 1904-05, was temporarily paralyzed, leaving the Franco-Russian alliance weakened. Italy, formerly allied to Germany and Austria-Hungary in the Triple Alliance, showed signs of wavering, particularly over Mediterranean questions. In this fragile diplomatic landscape, Morocco became more than a colonial matter. It became a barometer of Europe's balance of power. When Wilhelm declared his support for Moroccan independence at Tangier, he was in effect calling into question the legitimacy of the Entente Cordiale. If Germany could force the Moroccan issue onto the table of an international conference, it would compel Britain and France to defend their arrangement before other powers. A failure to do so would expose their alliance as fragile. A successful defense would demonstrate the solidity of their cooperation, but at the risk of driving Germany further into isolation. Thus, the Moroccan question in 1905 was not about Morocco alone. It was about the right of great powers to partition and influence regions without the consent of others, about the testing of alliances, and about the shape of the emerging international order. France sought to absorb Morocco into its North African empire. Britain sought to secure the Mediterranean routes. Germany sought recognition of its place among the decision-makers. At the center, Sultan Abdelaziz struggled merely to preserve his throne. The question was now on the table, and as Wilhelm's yacht sailed away from Tangier, the European press grasped its meaning. Morocco, once peripheral, had become the litmus test of the new alliance system. What began as a ceremonial declaration now pointed unmistakably toward confrontation. The Moroccan crisis unfolded at a moment when British diplomacy was undergoing a profound transformation, guided in no small measure by King Edward VII himself. Since his accession in 1901, Edward had demonstrated an unusual interest in foreign affairs, far more than his mother, Queen Victoria, who had often maintained a detached ceremonial role. Edward, by contrast, cultivated statesmen personally, using his presence at European courts, his command of languages, and his appetite for conversation to create what contemporaries described as an informal diplomacy that complemented the official work of the Foreign Office. His influence was subtle yet unmistakable, and it became critical in the years between 1901 and 1905 when Britain sought to reorient itself away from isolation and toward selective ententes. For much of the 19th century, Britain had pursued what contemporaries called splendid isolation. Secure behind the Royal Navy and its empire, London had seen little need for permanent continental alliances. Its policy revolved around maintaining the balance of power in Europe without binding commitments. Yet by the turn of the century, that policy became increasingly untenable. The rise of Germany as a naval and industrial power unsettled the Admiralty. The Boer War, 1899 to 1902, had revealed Britain's vulnerability, as the conflict drew sharp criticism from other powers and stretched military resources. By 1903, Britain's statesmen recognized the necessity of closer ties on the continent. Edward VII was central to this pivot. His state visit to Paris in 1903, accompanied by Foreign Secretary Lord Lansdowne, was more than ceremonial. Edward charmed the French public and political class, deliberately emphasizing reconciliation after centuries of rivalry. Crowds shouted "Vive l'Entente" as the king traveled through Paris. Newspapers in both countries declared the end of the ancient quarrel. Out of these gestures grew the Entente Cordiale of 1904, an agreement that, while primarily colonial in scope, carried immense psychological weight. It reassured France that Britain would not oppose its ambitions in Morocco, while confirming Britain's predominance in Egypt. Though technically non-military, the Entente created the framework for mutual trust. Kaiser Wilhelm II viewed these developments with suspicion, even resentment. He regarded Edward VII as the architect of what he derisively called encirclement, the gradual knitting together of France, Russia, and Britain into an anti-German coalition. Wilhelm's personal relationship with Edward was strained. Though the two were related, Wilhelm was Edward's nephew. Their temperaments clashed. Edward's smooth, measured style contrasted with Wilhelm's impulsive, theatrical approach. The Kaiser distrusted Edward's travels to continental capitals, convinced that behind the handshakes and banquets lay secret intrigues. The Moroccan question thus intersected directly with Edwardian diplomacy. To Wilhelm, the Tangier Declaration was a way to probe whether Edward's Entente was substantive or fragile. Would Britain truly stand by France over Morocco, a territory of little direct concern to London, or would the partnership dissolve under German pressure? Wilhelm wagered that Edward's diplomacy was superficial, that Britain would revert to its traditional aloofness rather than risk confrontation. Yet Edward understood Morocco's symbolic importance. For him, the issue was less about the Sultan or the Straits than about credibility. If Britain abandoned France at the first test, the Entente would collapse, and France might be forced into a new accommodation with Germany. Such a shift would leave Britain isolated once again, at a time when German naval construction threatened its supremacy. By contrast, standing firm beside France and Morocco would demonstrate that Britain had turned a corner in its diplomacy, committing itself to the balance of power with greater seriousness. Inside Britain, the debate was not without controversy. The Foreign Office, under Lansdowne and later Sir Edward Grey, recognized that the Entente carried risks. Public opinion remained wary of continental entanglements, haunted by memories of the Napoleonic Wars and the expense of overseas campaigns. Yet the Admiralty, led by figures such as Admiral Sir John Fisher, emphasized the strategic necessity of keeping France friendly. If France were hostile, Britain would be forced to defend both the Channel and the Mediterranean, a near impossible task even for the world's largest navy. Cooperation with France, on the other hand, allowed Britain to concentrate naval forces against Germany in the North Sea. Edward's diplomacy was reinforced by these strategic calculations. He traveled frequently to France, reinforcing the new cordiality. His presence reassured French leaders that Britain's promises were not merely paper agreements, but reflected the will of the monarch himself. In 1905, as the Moroccan crisis erupted, this mattered profoundly. French leaders, alarmed by Wilhelm's declarations, looked immediately to London for reassurance. They found in Edward a steady advocate for solidarity. The Kaiser, meanwhile, grew increasingly vocal in his criticism of Edward. He described his uncle as the arch-intriguer of Europe, weaving alliances behind closed doors. German newspapers echoed these themes, portraying the Entente as a conspiracy designed to isolate Germany. Wilhelm's suspicion was not entirely unfounded. Edward did indeed see the web of alliances as the safeguard of peace, though peace on terms favorable to Britain and France. By promoting stability in the Mediterranean and counterbalancing Germany, Edward believed he was preserving the European order. Thus, Morocco became more than a colonial dispute. It became the stage upon which Edward's diplomatic project was tested against Wilhelm's challenge. The personal rivalry between the two monarchs gave the crisis a symbolic edge, but beneath it lay structural realities. Britain's security required France's cooperation. France's confidence required Britain's support. Germany's bid to unravel that understanding would determine whether the Entente was a fragile accord or the foundation of a new European alignment. By the summer of 1905, as diplomatic notes flew between capitals, Edward's position was increasingly clear. Britain would stand by France. That decision, though not yet formalized in military terms, carried immense weight. It signaled to Germany that the Entente was more than a colonial bargain. It was a partnership of political will. For Edward, the test of his diplomacy had arrived. For Wilhelm, the encirclement he feared seemed ever more real. Morocco, outwardly distant, had become the center of Europe's great rivalry. If Edward VII's diplomacy had given France a new sense of confidence, Berlin's leaders were determined to expose its fragility. The Moroccan question was chosen not because Morocco itself offered direct advantages to Germany, but because it presented a vulnerable seam in the fabric of the Entente Cordiale. By striking at that seam, Chancellor Bernhard von Bülow and Kaiser Wilhelm II hoped to weaken the Anglo-French understanding before it could harden into something more formidable. The plan rested on a calculated gamble: that Britain, despite Edward's efforts, would not risk its global position for the sake of Morocco, and that France, under pressure, would concede rather than confront. In Berlin's view, the Entente was a diplomatic novelty rather than a binding alliance. If Germany could push hard enough, the French might be forced into retreat, and Britain would stand aside. That outcome would humiliate France, isolate Edward VII, and reassert Germany's claim to a decisive voice in world affairs. Von Bülow's strategy was not improvised. As early as January 1905, months before Wilhelm's Tangier visit, the Chancellor had signaled to his colleagues that Germany must take the offensive in diplomacy to break the encirclement forming around it. His calculation was that crises could be manufactured and exploited to Germany's advantage, forcing other powers to recognize Berlin's weight. Morocco, precisely because it had been quietly partitioned by Britain and France without German consultation, provided the perfect test case. Wilhelm, always drawn to dramatic gestures, embraced the plan with enthusiasm. His Tangier speech in March was meant as the opening shot of a wider campaign, designed to force France into an international conference. Germany's demands would be framed in the language of international law: that Moroccan reforms, policing, and economic concessions must be placed under international oversight rather than French control. Behind this legal argument lay the real objective: to prove that France could not act without Germany's consent, and that Britain's supposed support was conditional at best. The gamble relied heavily on perceptions. Berlin did not anticipate, nor indeed desire, immediate war over Morocco. Instead, the expectation was that the threat of conflict would be enough to coerce concessions. German officials hinted repeatedly that refusal to negotiate might provoke military consequences, knowing that France was vulnerable. The French army, though formidable on paper, was still in the midst of reorganization. Russia, France's eastern ally, was collapsing under the weight of the Russo-Japanese War and the 1905 revolution. Britain, Germany assumed, would hesitate to entangle itself. Thus, the pressure could be maximized at minimum risk. Yet the German approach contained within it a critical miscalculation, an underestimation of French resolve and British commitment. Von Bülow believed that French Foreign Minister Théophile Delcasse would back down once confronted with the possibility of isolation. He misread both the man and the mood in Paris. Delcasse, though controversial at home, was fiercely attached to defending French prestige. He argued in cabinet that yielding to Berlin would undo everything gained by the Entente Cordiale and would return France to the humiliation of the 1870s, when it had been forced to endure the loss of Alsace-Lorraine without allies. German diplomats pressed harder. They circulated memoranda to other capitals insisting that Germany's only interest was in safeguarding free trade and Moroccan sovereignty. In reality, their rhetoric carried implicit threats. If France refused a conference, Germany would regard it as grounds for a confrontation. The word war was never formally used in official dispatches, but the undertone was unmistakable. By late spring, the crisis had escalated beyond Morocco itself. The real question was whether France would submit to German demands or whether the Entente would hold. Wilhelm himself grew increasingly strident in his comments. He spoke to advisors of teaching the French a lesson and described the Entente as a paper house of cards. His public posture was no less provocative. German newspapers carried caricatures mocking Edward VII as a schemer and portraying France as dependent on Britain's goodwill. The propaganda was meant to stiffen German public opinion for confrontation, but it also revealed the underlying overconfidence of Berlin's position. Military considerations reinforced this confidence. The German General Staff, under Alfred von Schlieffen, assured the Kaiser that the army was prepared for eventualities should the crisis escalate. France, weakened by its commitments in North Africa and by the instability of Russia, was seen as incapable of waging a major war without British support. Schlieffen himself emphasized that while war was not desirable in 1905, the very threat of it could force Paris into submission. This belief encouraged Wilhelm and von Bülow to press their demands harder than prudence might have dictated. Yet the gamble contained risks that Berlin underestimated. Britain, far from remaining aloof, viewed the German challenge as an assault on the Entente itself. Edward VII's personal diplomacy had cultivated genuine goodwill in Paris, and British officials recognized that abandoning France over Morocco would render their new alignment worthless. Moreover, the strategic issue of Gibraltar loomed large. If Germany gained influence in Morocco, Britain's naval position in the Mediterranean would be compromised. Thus, what Berlin saw as a colonial dispute, London perceived as a matter of grand strategy. Within France, the crisis soon reached a breaking point. Delcasse, whose insistence on standing firm angered Germany, became the focal point of pressure. German diplomats demanded his dismissal as the price for avoiding escalation. In June 1905, under mounting strain, the French government forced him to resign, an outcome celebrated in Berlin as proof of success. But the removal of Delcasse did not produce the capitulation Germany expected. Instead, it hardened French opinion, convincing many in Paris that concessions only invited further demands. Thus, Germany's gamble, though it appeared to achieve a tactical victory in Delcasse's fall, planted the seeds of strategic failure. By overplaying its hand, Berlin ensured that France would cling more tightly to Britain, and that Britain, in turn, would see the necessity of demonstrating its reliability. Instead of weakening the Entente, Germany risked consolidating it. The gamble, designed to test Edwardian diplomacy, would ultimately expose its own flaws. The resignation of Théophile Delcasse in June 1905 marked the most visible success of Germany's Moroccan gamble. For months, Delcasse had embodied French defiance, warning colleagues that to yield before Berlin's threats would erase the achievements of the Entente Cordiale and return France to the isolation of the 1890s. His fall was a triumph for Chancellor von Bülow, who could point to it as proof that German pressure worked. Yet beneath the surface, the consequences were more ambiguous. France was indeed shaken, but it was not broken. Delcasse's removal was engineered through a combination of German intimidation and French political calculation. In Paris, Prime Minister Maurice Rouvier judged that Delcasse's rigid stance threatened to push the country toward war, for which it was unprepared. France's military position in mid-1905 was uncertain. The army had strength on paper, nearly 500,000 men under arms, with universal conscription providing depth, but its general staff was divided over strategy. Defenses along the eastern frontier had been strengthened since 1871, but the memory of defeat in the Franco-Prussian War still weighed heavily. Without Russia's assistance on the Eastern Front, France faced the nightmare of confronting Germany alone. Russia's collapse in 1905 was decisive in shaping French calculations. The Russo-Japanese War, culminating in Russia's catastrophic defeat at Tsushima in May, destroyed the credibility of the Russian fleet and triggered political upheaval at home. Revolution erupted in St. Petersburg, strikes paralyzed the empire, and mutinies spread across the armed forces. For French strategists, the alliance that had guaranteed a two-front war against Germany was suddenly in suspension. Paris could not rely on Russian support, at least not in the immediate crisis. This reality lent weight to Rouvier's argument that France must buy time, even if it meant sacrificing Delcasse. Yet the manner of Delcasse's departure created its own backlash. In Berlin, officials hailed his resignation as evidence that France had capitulated to German will. German newspapers gloated, depicting Delcasse as the victim of his own arrogance. In France, however, public opinion recoiled from the humiliation. Crowds in Paris jeered at the idea that Germany could dictate ministerial appointments in the French Republic. The press, even those papers skeptical of Delcasse, warned that submission encouraged further bullying. The political class was divided. Some urged conciliation to avoid war, others insisted that French prestige must be restored by firmness. The Sultan of Morocco, Abdelaziz, observed these developments with wary interest. For him, the removal of Delcasse suggested that Germany's intervention might protect his independence after all. He issued statements welcoming international involvement in Moroccan reforms, signaling openness to the idea of a conference. Yet the Moroccan court remained fractured. Tribal revolts in the interior continued to erode royal authority, and European gunboats at Casablanca and Tangier reminded the Sultan that his sovereignty existed largely at the sufferance of the great powers. Within France, the Rouvier government attempted to navigate between humiliation and escalation. On one hand, it agreed to the principle of an international conference, hoping to defuse the crisis without conceding substantive control. On the other, it sought reassurance from Britain that the Entente remained firm. This balancing act was precarious. If Britain hesitated, France risked isolation. If Britain stood firm, Germany might escalate further. The diplomatic burden placed upon Paris was heavy, and every move was scrutinized by Berlin for signs of weakness. The French General Staff, though constrained by civilian caution, quietly accelerated preparations. Reinforcements were shifted toward Algeria, where the possibility of a German-backed tribal uprising was feared. Contingency plans for mobilization were updated, though not enacted. Officers debated whether France could sustain a defensive war long enough for Britain to intervene. Many doubted it, yet the very discussion revealed that France, though pressured, was not resigned to permanent retreat. Public opinion, volatile as always, became a force the government could not ignore. The humiliation of Delcasse's fall stirred a wave of nationalist sentiment. Organizations such as the Ligue de la Patrie Française denounced German interference and demanded vigilance. Veterans associations invoked the memory of 1870, warning that dishonor invited aggression. The press carried serialized articles recounting the Franco-Prussian War, reminding readers of the consequences of weakness. Though the government urged calm, the atmosphere in Paris was one of simmering resentment. The dynamic placed France in an uncomfortable middle position. Officially, it had conceded to German demands for a conference. Unofficially, it sought to recover lost prestige through firmness in the negotiations to come. Rouvier himself was no firebrand, but he recognized the danger of allowing Germany to claim complete victory. He therefore reached out discreetly to London, seeking assurances that Britain would stand by its commitments under the Entente. The British response, though cautious, offered encouragement. Edward VII's government indicated that it viewed the Moroccan issue not as a colonial quarrel, but as a test of European balance. Germany, however, misinterpreted the French position. Convinced that Delcasse's resignation signaled weakness, von Bülow assumed that France would ultimately yield at the conference as well. He underestimated the degree to which French humiliation had stiffened resolve. particularly once backed by British support. Berlin's triumph in June would soon prove Pyrrhic, for it galvanized rather than weakened the very alignment Germany hoped to unravel. As the summer of 1905 progressed, France endured the strain of being at the center of Europe's attention. The government faced the unenviable task of appearing conciliatory enough to avoid immediate war, yet firm enough to reassure its own public and deter further German demands. The streets of Paris buzzed with rumors. Newspapers speculated on British fleets, German armies, and Russian unrest. In provincial towns, reservists were reminded to keep themselves prepared for call-up, though no mobilization orders were issued. The uncertainty weighed heavily, but it also forged a clearer understanding among French leaders. Survival required solidarity with Britain. By the time autumn approached, the outlines of the crisis were clearer. Germany had forced Delcassés' resignation and secured agreement for an international conference to be held in Spain. France had been humiliated but not destroyed. Britain's quiet reassurances suggested that the Entente would endure. The Sultan of Morocco, caught in the middle, continued to balance precariously. Europe watched, holding its breath, as the stage was set for the confrontation at Algeciras. France had been placed under immense pressure, but the attempt to break its will had not succeeded. Instead, the crisis had reinforced the central reality of early 20th century diplomacy, that honor, prestige, and the perception of resolve mattered as much as armies and fleets. Germany's gamble had achieved a tactical gain, but the strategic contest was only beginning. Amid the maneuverings of Paris, Berlin, and London, the figure most ostensibly at the center of the Moroccan question was Sultan Abdelaziz, though in practice he had little control over the crisis that bore his name. His reign, which began in 1894 after the death of his father, Hassan I, had from the start been defined by vulnerability. Elevated to the throne at the age of 16, Abdelaziz relied heavily on regents and court advisors during his minority. Even after assuming formal power, he lacked the authority of his predecessors. The Sultanate's hold over the Moroccan interior was tenuous, constantly challenged by tribal confederations and regional warlords. In this context, the sudden attention of Europe's great powers offered opportunities for leverage, but also threatened to erode sovereignty altogether. To European observers, Morocco under Abdelaziz was a state ripe for intervention. Its administration was fragmented, its finances were precarious. Attempts at modernization, such as the acquisition of telegraph lines, the importation of European rifles, and the introduction of new taxes to finance them, had alienated traditional elites without producing effective reform. The treasury was heavily indebted, often dependent on advances from foreign bankers. In 1904, French financiers had extended new loans under terms that gave Paris considerable influence over customs revenues. Abdelaziz, pressed for resources, accepted these arrangements, though they compromised his independence. His court in Fez reflected the contradictions of his reign. On the one hand, European advisors and emissaries circulated in the palace, offering schemes for modernization and reform. On the other, conservative courtiers resisted these innovations, accusing the young sultan of undermining Islamic traditions by embracing foreign ways. The clash between modernizers and traditionalists left Abdelaziz isolated, caught between internal factions and external pressures. His youth and inexperience made him a convenient figure for foreign chancelleries to invoke as a symbol of independence, even as they schemed to strip him of real authority. Germany's intervention in 1905 gave Abdelaziz an unexpected reprieve. When Wilhelm II declared in Tangier that he recognized Morocco as a free and independent state, the Sultan could publicly welcome this recognition as a vindication of his sovereignty. Moroccan newspapers, influenced by German envoys, published editorials praising the Kaiser's support. Abdelaziz himself received German envoys with courtesy, signaling his gratitude for their stand against French encroachment. Yet this gesture placed him in an awkward position vis-à-vis France, which regarded his cooperation with Berlin as evidence of ingratitude after years of financial assistance. In reality, Abdelaziz had little room to maneuver. Moroccan politics in the early 20th century were defined not only by European pressures, but also by persistent internal unrest. Revolts erupted in the Rif Mountains, where Berber tribes resisted central authority. The southern provinces remained only loosely attached to the Sultan's writ, often acknowledging him in name while exercising practical autonomy. European powers exploited these divisions, using tribal grievances as pretexts for intervention. French officers in Algeria observed cross-border smuggling of arms and noted the porous frontier as a security threat. Spanish officials in Melilla and Ceuta pressed Madrid to act more aggressively to protect their own interests. The young Sultan was aware of these challenges, but his tools were limited. His army, the Moroccan forces traditionally loyal to the throne, numbered only around 10,000 men, poorly equipped and inadequately trained compared with European standards. Efforts to modernize the force by purchasing European rifles and artillery had been hampered by lack of funds. Tribal levies could be raised in times of crisis, but their loyalty was uncertain and their discipline minimal. Thus, Abdelaziz could not credibly resist European intrusion militarily. His only weapon was diplomacy, playing powers against one another to preserve as much autonomy as possible. In the summer of 1905, as the prospect of an international conference loomed, Abdelaziz found himself courted by multiple sides. German envoys promised that the conference would guarantee Moroccan independence by subjecting reforms to international oversight rather than French monopoly. French officials, by contrast, pressed him to accept their guidance as the only means of preserving stability. British representatives reassured him of their respect for his sovereignty, though everyone knew that London's overriding concern was strategic rather than altruistic. To each delegation, Abdelaziz responded cautiously, offering polite words without firm commitments. His hope was that Morocco might emerge from the conference with its independence nominally intact, even if in practice foreign influence deepened. The reality, however, was that Morocco's fate would be decided not in Fez but in the chancelleries of Europe. Abdelaziz's role was largely ceremonial, his sovereignty invoked but not respected. This dynamic reflected a broader pattern of the era, when weak states on the periphery of the European system were drawn into great power rivalries with little agency of their own. Morocco, like Persia or the Ottoman Empire, became a pawn in contests of prestige and security between stronger neighbors. Nevertheless, Abdelaziz's position was not entirely without significance. His willingness to welcome German recognition gave Berlin the fig leaf of legitimacy it required to press its case for a conference. Without the Sultan's nominal assent, German claims to be defending Moroccan independence would have rung hollow. Similarly, his acceptance of French loans and advisors ensured that Paris could argue it had a special role to play in Moroccan reforms. Each side used the Sultan's gestures as ammunition in their diplomatic battle, while his actual capacity to shape events dwindled. By late 1905, as preparations for the Algeciras Conference began, Abdelaziz had become emblematic of the paradox facing many rulers in the age of imperialism. A sovereign in name, yet dependent on the very powers that threatened his autonomy. His court remained restless, his subjects skeptical of his policies, and his finances under foreign control. Still, he clung to the hope that by balancing Germany against France, and by appealing to international law, he might preserve the fiction of Moroccan independence. In truth, the outcome of the crisis would demonstrate the limits of such a strategy. Abdelaziz's role was that of a pawn, invoked by others but never the master of the game. His kingdom was the stage upon which Europe's rivalries played out, and his throne, though gilded in tradition, stood increasingly at the mercy of decisions taken in Berlin, Paris, and London. The Moroccan Sultanate had become less a sovereign polity than a symbol, of independence invoked but compromised, of sovereignty defended but hollowed out. As Morocco slipped ever deeper into the grip of European rivalry, the crisis reverberated through the chancelleries of the continent. Abdelaziz's throne in Fez was fragile, but the balance of power in Europe was equally delicate. Every move in Paris or Berlin prompted calculations in Vienna, Rome, St. Petersburg, and London. By late 1905, Morocco had ceased to be a North African question. It had become a European one, testing the cohesion of alliances and the credibility of commitments. Austria-Hungary was the first to declare its alignment with Germany, though its enthusiasm was measured. Foreign Minister Count Agenor Galachowski assured Berlin that the dual monarchy would support German demands for a conference on Morocco. The Habsburg Empire, bound to Germany through the dual alliance of 1879, could scarcely do otherwise. Yet behind the formality, Vienna harbored misgivings. The monarchy's position in the Balkans was precarious, threatened by rising Slavic nationalism and the ambitions of Russia. For Galachowski, the Moroccan affair offered little tangible benefit and risked drawing Austria into a quarrel far removed from its own frontiers. Nevertheless, loyalty to Berlin required public solidarity. The result was a muted endorsement. Austria stood with Germany, but half-heartedly, a reminder of the fragility of even long-standing alliances. Russia, by contrast, was in no position to act at all. The empire had been shattered by its defeat in the Russo-Japanese War earlier that year. The naval catastrophe at Tsushima in May 1905 had destroyed the Baltic Fleet, dispatched at enormous cost around the world only to be annihilated in a single day. At home, revolutions spread across the empire. Strikes, mutinies, and uprisings forced Nicholas II to concede a Duma, transforming Russian politics under duress. In such conditions, Russia could offer France little assistance. Though bound to Paris by the Franco-Russian alliance of 1894, St. Petersburg could not risk confrontation with Germany over Morocco while struggling to suppress unrest at home. For France, this meant that its eastern ally was effectively neutralized, reducing the deterrent value of the alliance at precisely the moment when Berlin applied maximum pressure. Italy's stance was still more uncertain. As a member of the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, Rome was formally committed to Berlin's side. Yet Italian interests in the Mediterranean often clashed with those of France and Austria. Italy had ambitions in North Africa, particularly in Libya, then still nominally under Ottoman control. Moroccan questions held little appeal compared with the prospect of eventual expansion across the Mediterranean. Prime Minister Giovanni Giolitti and Foreign Minister Tommaso Tittoni therefore hesitated to commit fully to Berlin's line. Rome signaled its willingness to attend a conference, but avoided strong statements in Germany's favor. Italian policy in this period was marked by opportunism. Formally allied to Germany, yet careful not to foreclose cooperation with France. In the Moroccan crisis, this ambiguity became apparent. The position of Britain was therefore decisive. With Austria-Hungary's support lukewarm, Russia incapacitated, and Italy wavering, Germany relied upon the assumption that Britain would remain detached. Without London's backing, France might be compelled to concede. Yet Edward VII's diplomacy and the calculations of the Foreign Office pointed in the opposite direction. Britain's leaders increasingly recognized that the German challenge in Morocco was less about trade or sovereignty than about the credibility of the Entente. If Britain failed to support France now, the new relationship painstakingly built since 1903 would collapse, leaving Paris vulnerable and London once again isolated. Public opinion in Britain was divided, but not paralyzed. Some newspapers, notably the Daily Mail, warned against being dragged into continental quarrels over Morocco, a land with which Britain had little direct connection. Others, including the Times, argued that German interference threatened the balance of power in the Mediterranean. The Admiralty, led by Admiral Sir John Fisher, stressed the strategic dimension. If Germany gained influence in Morocco, Britain's control of the Strait of Gibraltar could be compromised. From that perspective, French predominance in Morocco was preferable, as it aligned with Britain's Mediterranean strategy. The debate in London was sharpened by the broader naval rivalry with Germany. Since 1898, the German Navy laws had authorized rapid construction of battleships, directly challenging British naval supremacy. By 1905, the outlines of this competition were visible, even if the Dreadnought Revolution had not yet begun. In such circumstances, German diplomacy in Morocco was seen through the lens of encirclement and threat. Britain could not afford to allow Germany both a naval challenge in the North Sea and a foothold in North Africa. Thus, as autumn 1905 advanced, Europe held its breath. Austria-Hungary stood formally beside Germany, but with hesitation. Russia was incapacitated. Italy was uncertain. Britain, still weighing its options, leaned steadily toward France. In Paris, these calculations mattered enormously. The French government understood that without British support, it would enter the Algeciras Conference in a position of weakness, vulnerable to German pressure. With Britain beside it, however, the situation changed dramatically. Germany would find itself confronted by a united Anglo-French front, difficult to break. In Berlin, these signals were misread. Von Bülow and his colleagues convinced themselves that Britain would ultimately not risk confrontation. They saw Edward VI's diplomacy as superficial and assumed that British public opinion would restrain the government from committing too deeply. The Kaiser, too, dismissed the possibility that his uncle would oppose him directly. The result was a dangerous overconfidence. Germany prepared for the conference as if it would have the support of at least some neutral powers, and as if France would be forced into retreat. The stage was thus set for a confrontation whose outcome would determine the trajectory of European diplomacy. Morocco remained the nominal subject, but behind it loomed the broader questions. Would the Entente Cordiale survive its first real test? Would Britain abandon its long-standing aloofness to back France? Would Germany succeed in dividing its rivals, or instead drive them closer together? The autumn of 1905 was therefore a season of waiting. Armies were not mobilized, but staffs prepared. No declarations were issued, but newspapers speculated daily on war. In cafes from Paris to Berlin, in the markets of Vienna, in the docks of London, the Moroccan crisis was discussed as though conflict might erupt at any moment. The great capitals watched one another closely. Each move weighed for its implications. Europe was holding its breath, suspended between the memory of past wars and the possibility of a new one. By the close of 1905, the Moroccan crisis had reached a juncture where Britain's position could no longer remain ambiguous. For months, Berlin had wagered that London would hesitate to entangle itself in a continental quarrel. The Kaiser, buoyed by his advisors, believed that British opinion would recoil at the prospect of backing France in North Africa. Yet as the weeks passed, it became increasingly clear that Britain's government, pressed by both strategic realities and the personal diplomacy of Edward VII, would not leave Paris isolated. The decisive turn began in the Foreign Office, where Sir Edward Grey, soon to replace Lord Lansdowne, articulated the logic of solidarity. Grey, though cautious in temperament, recognized the strategic stakes. If Germany succeeded in humbling France over Morocco, the Entente Cordiale would collapse, and Britain would face the prospect of an emboldened Germany dominating both the North Sea and the approaches to the Mediterranean. For the Admiralty, this was unacceptable. The Royal Navy's supremacy was predicated on controlling maritime choke points, and Gibraltar was among the most vital. A Morocco aligned with or penetrated by German influence would alter the balance of naval power in the Western Mediterranean. The Admiralty's calculations meshed with Edward VI's instincts. The king had spent the better part of his reign cultivating French goodwill, repairing centuries of antagonism. To retreat now would undo that work. His conversations with French leaders had impressed upon him the depth of their insecurity. The humiliation of Delcass's dismissal had left Paris resentful but determined. Without Britain's reassurance, however, France risked further concessions to Germany. Edward understood that credibility was the currency of diplomacy. If Britain abandoned France at the first test, no other power would trust British commitments in the future. Public opinion, though never the sole determinant of policy, began to shift in support of firmness. The Times, long a barometer of establishment thinking, declared that Britain could not remain passive while Germany imposed its will. The Morning Post argued that German ambitions in Morocco were part of a larger design to challenge Britain's global position. Even critics of continental entanglement acknowledged that Gibraltar's security was non-negotiable. In Parliament, debates revealed skepticism about war, but also recognition that Britain's interests were bound up with France's prestige. The specter of German naval expansion added urgency. Fisher's reforms in the Royal Navy were directed above all at countering the high seas fleet, and Morocco was understood as another front in that rivalry. Diplomatic exchanges reflected this new clarity. British envoys in Paris conveyed reassurances that London regarded Morocco as a test case for the Entente itself. At the same time, notes to Berlin warned that Britain supported the principle of French predominance. The language was measured but unmistakable. For Berlin, accustomed to British aloofness, these signals were disquieting. Von Bülow had built his strategy on the assumption that Britain would not risk solidarity with France. Now that assumption was eroding. Edward VII himself added weight through personal interventions. Though constitutionally limited, he used his influence freely. He corresponded with French President Émile Loubet and met with visiting dignitaries to underscore Britain's commitment. His presence at state occasions and his carefully chosen words in conversation carried symbolic power, reinforcing the impression that Britain's monarch himself regarded the Entente as sacrosanct. In this respect, Edward's style of diplomacy, informal, personal, persistent, proved invaluable. By late autumn, the outlines of Britain's position were unmistakable. It would stand beside France at the forthcoming Algeciras Conference. The effect in Paris was immediate. French leaders, still reeling from Delcasse's fall, found in British support a renewed sense of confidence. Prime Minister Rouvier, though cautious by nature, began to signal that France would not yield further to German demands. The French press, long quick to detect signs of isolation, now spoke of Anglo-French solidarity as a reality rather than a hope. For Germany, the shift was deeply unsettling. The entire purpose of the Moroccan gamble had been to weaken the Entente Cordiale. Instead, Berlin now faced the prospect of confronting Britain and France together. The calculation that Britain would avoid involvement had backfired. Wilhelm II, still convinced of his ability to sway opinion, spoke optimistically of neutral states rallying to Germany at the conference. Yet his advisors increasingly recognized that the diplomatic ground was shifting. Even Austria-Hungary, though formally supportive, could offer only limited weight. Italy was unreliable. Russia was incapacitated. Germany's margin of maneuver was narrowing. The international implications extended beyond Europe. In Washington, the Roosevelt administration watched closely. American interest in Morocco was limited, but the crisis was seen as a test of the principle of the open door. Sympathy leaned toward France, particularly after British reassurances. In Tokyo, flush with victory over Russia, officials quietly noted Germany's difficulties as evidence of the shifting balance in Europe. Morocco's resonance had become global. The decisive moment came when Britain signaled not only moral but material support. The Admiralty hinted that, should conflict arise, the Royal Navy would secure the Channel and Mediterranean, freeing French forces for continental defense. No formal military convention was signed, but the implication was clear. German planners, particularly Schlieffen, understood the significance. A united Anglo-French position would complicate any prospect of a short, decisive campaign in the West. The entire strategic premise of the Moroccan gamble, that France could be coerced without Britain, was crumbling. By the end of 1905, Europe understood that Britain had stepped in. The Moroccan crisis was no longer a bilateral confrontation between France and Germany. It was a test of the emerging Anglo-French partnership. Edward VII's diplomacy, combined with strategic calculation in Whitehall, had transformed the situation. Where Germany had sought division, it had inadvertently fostered unity. The stage was thus set for the Algeciras Conference. Britain's entry into the crisis altered the balance irrevocably. France, reassured, prepared to defend its claims with new resolve. Germany, frustrated but committed, prepared to press its case. The rest of Europe, from Vienna to Rome to St. Petersburg, waited to see how the confrontation would unfold. The Moroccan Sultan, whose independence was the nominal subject of dispute, could only watch as his fate was debated thousands of miles away. Europe was aligned in two camps, and the world was poised for a confrontation not of armies but of diplomats, yet whose consequences would echo in military planning for years to come. By the winter of 1905, the Moroccan question had moved from diplomatic maneuvering to preparations for a formal showdown. Germany, having insisted upon an international conference, now achieved its immediate objective. The major powers agreed that representatives would convene in the Spanish port city of Algeciras in January 1906. To Berlin, this appeared a victory. France had been forced, against its initial objections, to submit its claims in Morocco to the judgment of Europe. Yet the apparent triumph concealed deeper vulnerabilities. The alignment of powers leading into the conference suggested that Germany had isolated itself more than it had isolated its rivals. The choice of Algeciras as the venue was itself significant. Located on the Bay of Gibraltar, just across the strait from Tangier, the Spanish port offered symbolic proximity to the Moroccan issue while ensuring that the proceedings unfolded on European soil. Spain, though granted a role under the Entente Cordiale, remained formally neutral, a host acceptable to all. King Alfonso XIII of Spain expressed satisfaction at his country's elevation to a stage of international diplomacy, but Madrid's role was largely ceremonial. The real actors would be the major powers, Germany, France, Britain, Austria-Hungary, Italy, Russia, and the United States, joined by a handful of smaller states. For France, the months preceding the conference were a time of preparation and repair. The humiliation of Delcasse's resignation had left scars, but British support provided new confidence. Prime Minister Maurice Rouvier and his advisors set about constructing a diplomatic front that would emphasize moderation. France would not present itself as seeking outright annexation of Morocco, but as the power best suited to reform and stability. The emphasis was on policing and financial oversight, functions that France argued it was uniquely positioned to fulfill by virtue of its geographic proximity and existing commitments. Britain's support was crucial in shaping this approach. Sir Edward Grey, who became Foreign Secretary in December 1905 after the fall of the Conservative government, affirmed continuity with Lansdowne's policies. Grey's instructions to British delegates emphasized solidarity with France while avoiding inflammatory rhetoric. London's line was clear. France could count on British backing, but it must present its case in terms acceptable to international opinion. Britain would not support a naked partition, but it would support France as the responsible guarantor of Moroccan reforms. Germany entered the preparatory stage with outward confidence, but internal unease. Von Bülow framed the conference as a vindication of German diplomacy, proof that Berlin could not be excluded from global questions. Yet privately, German officials worried about the alignment of other powers. Austria-Hungary's support was secure but lukewarm. Italy remained equivocal, unwilling to damage its prospects in North Africa by alienating France entirely. Russia, paralyzed by revolution and military defeat, was scarcely a factor. The United States, whose delegate was instructed by President Theodore Roosevelt, leaned towards sympathy with the French position, though formally committed to impartiality. The danger for Germany was that its demands for an open door and international control might find few takers. In Berlin, debates raged over how far to press the Moroccan claim. The Foreign Office urged moderation, warning that excessive demands would alienate neutrals. Wilhelm II, however, favored a more confrontational posture. He believed that if Germany displayed firmness, smaller states would rally to its banner out of fear of Anglo-French domination. This divergence produced mixed signals. German rhetoric oscillated between appeals to international law and sharp denunciations of French ambition. The lack of a coherent strategy would later undermine Berlin's effectiveness at Algeciras. The Sultan of Morocco, Abdelaziz, was formally invited to participate but knew that his role would be token. He sent emissaries to Europe with instructions to preserve the appearance of sovereignty, emphasizing Morocco's desire for independence under the reforms of its ruler. In reality, Abdelaziz had little leverage. His kingdom was increasingly destabilized by tribal uprisings, and his reliance on foreign loans left him dependent on European bankers. His hope was that the internationalization of the issue would at least prevent outright annexation, allowing him to remain on the throne as a symbolic sovereign. As the conference approached, press coverage in Europe intensified. In Paris, newspapers framed the issue as a matter of national honor, warning that France must not permit another humiliation. In Berlin, commentators portrayed the event as Germany's opportunity to defend international law against Anglo-French collusion. London papers emphasized the broader stakes. Whether Germany sought merely commercial access or intended to destabilize the balance of power. Across Europe, the sense grew that Algeciras was less about Morocco than about the credibility of alliances. Diplomatic maneuvering in the weeks before January 1906 further revealed the emerging blocs. France, Britain, and Spain coordinated positions, with Italy cautiously drawn into their orbit. The United States indicated privately that it would not support Germany if its demands proved excessive. Germany, by contrast, found itself relying heavily on Austria-Hungary as its only certain partner. What had begun as a German effort to expose divisions among its rivals threatened instead to highlight its own isolation. Yet war remained distant. Despite the heated rhetoric, no power seriously contemplated mobilization in the winter of 1905-06. The memory of the Franco-Prussian War lingered, but the appetite for immediate conflict was absent. The stakes at Algeciras were diplomatic rather than military. Yet precisely for that reason, prestige was paramount. A defeat at the conference table could shape perceptions of power as decisively as a defeat on the battlefield. Thus, as delegations prepared to sail for Spain, the atmosphere in Europe was tense but expectant. The German gamble had forced the issue into the open. The French humiliation had been partially repaired by British solidarity. The Moroccan Sultan awaited the verdict of foreign statesmen. Algeciras promised not resolution alone but revelation, of who commanded influence, of whose alliances held firm, and of how Europe would arrange itself in the years to come. The world's eyes turned toward the small Spanish port. What was at stake was not merely the fate of Morocco, but the credibility of diplomacy itself in an age of mounting rivalries. The conference would reveal whether Germany's bold challenge could reorder alliances, or whether it would mark the beginning of its diplomatic isolation. On January 16, 1906, representatives of 13 nations gathered in Algeciras, transforming the modest Andalusian port into the epicenter of international diplomacy. The city, normally a quiet harbor opposite Gibraltar, became temporarily unrecognizable. Hotels filled with diplomats, military attaches, journalists, and the entourages of Europe's great powers. Flags of multiple nations fluttered over balconies, and security was tightened by Spanish police, aware that the gathering symbolized not only the Moroccan question, but the fragile equilibrium of Europe itself. The scale of participation revealed the stakes. Beyond Germany, France, and Britain, the list of delegates included Austria-Hungary, Italy, Russia, Spain, Portugal, Belgium, the Netherlands, Sweden, and the United States. Sultan Abdelaziz of Morocco sent his own representatives, though their presence was more symbolic than decisive. The very breadth of attendance underscored Germany's initial success. By insisting on a conference, Berlin had forced Morocco onto the agenda of nearly every significant power. Yet the outcome would depend not on numbers, but on alignments, and those were less favorable than Berlin had imagined. Germany's delegation was led by Count Bernhard von Tattenbach, a capable diplomat, but without the stature to sway an international assembly through personal authority alone. He was instructed by Chancellor von Bülow to press firmly for open-door principles in Moroccan commerce and for international control of reforms, particularly in the policing of ports and customs. Germany's line was presented as a defense of Moroccan independence against French encroachment. In practice, it aimed to strip France of exclusive influence and to demonstrate that Europe as a whole must be consulted in colonial questions. France's delegation, headed by Jules Cambon, advanced a different vision. France claimed no annexationist designs, but it argued that its geographic proximity, long-standing financial involvement, and existing colonial responsibilities in Algeria made it uniquely suited to supervise Moroccan reforms. Cambon emphasized France's willingness to recognize Moroccan sovereignty formally while ensuring order and progress through French-led policing and administration. Britain's delegates echoed this stance, framing French leadership as the most practical solution. Spain, with its northern enclaves and long history of involvement, pressed for a subsidiary role. The first weeks of the conference were marked by tense exchanges. German representatives insisted that to grant France a privileged position would effectively make Morocco a protectorate, contrary to international law. French and British delegates countered that without a strong guiding hand, Morocco risked descending into chaos, a condition that would harm all commercial interests. Behind the arguments lay the larger contest. Germany sought to isolate France, while France and Britain sought to demonstrate the solidity of their alignment. The setting itself contributed to the drama. Delegates met in the Casa Consistorial, Algeciras' town hall, where long tables draped in green cloth were arranged in a circle to symbolize equality. Yet the hierarchy of power was never in doubt. Smaller states, though present, largely followed the cues of the great powers. Belgium and the Netherlands leaned toward France, influenced by their economic ties. Sweden adopted a cautious neutrality. Portugal, bound to Britain by an ancient alliance, supported London's line. Even the United States, represented by Ambassador Henry White, signaled quiet sympathy with France, though it couched its statements in the language of fairness and commerce. Tension rose in the debates over policing. Germany demanded that an international force, drawn from multiple powers, be established to maintain order in Morocco's ports. France countered that such a scheme was impractical, given the need for coordination along the frontier with Algeria. Britain supported the French position, stressing that divided authority would invite disorder rather than prevent it. After days of wrangling, Spain was proposed as a compromise partner, providing officers alongside the French in a joint policing arrangement. This solution, though not yet final, revealed the direction of the negotiations, toward confirmation of French primacy, dressed in the garb of multilateralism. For Sultan Abdelaziz's envoys, the proceedings were both humiliating and inevitable. They were permitted to speak of Morocco's sovereignty, to plead for respect of its independence, and to affirm the Sultan's desire for reform. But their interventions carried little weight. The assembled powers treated Moroccan independence as a formal principle, not a practical reality. The real question was who would exercise control, France alone, or France in concert with others. For Abdelaziz, the best hope was that international recognition of sovereignty, however hollow, would at least preserve the facade of legitimacy. As the weeks passed, Germany's position began to fray. Von Tattenbach, instructed to press hard, adopted a strident tone that alienated potential sympathizers. Italian delegates, initially hesitant, grew wary of Berlin's intransigence. Even Austria-Hungary, though loyal, offered support that was more perfunctory than persuasive. Isolated at the conference table, Germany found itself increasingly dependent on rhetoric rather than alliances. French delegates, by contrast, spoke with the assurance of British backing, and their calm tone contrasted with Germany's insistence. The press followed the proceedings with avid attention. In Paris, newspapers praised Cambon's defense of national honor, framing each compromise as evidence of French resolve. In Berlin, the tone was defensive. Editorials accused other powers of conspiring to exclude Germany. British papers emphasized Edward VII's role as the architect of the Anglo-French partnership, crediting his diplomacy with holding the line. Across Europe, the conference was understood as a test not of Morocco's future alone, but of Germany's ability to command international support. The atmosphere at Algeciras was often tense, but war seemed distant. The crisis was conducted in words rather than mobilizations, yet the consequences for prestige were immense. Every concession was weighed against public opinion at home. Every draft resolution was scrutinized for its symbolism as much as its substance. For France, the goal was to emerge affirmed in its role. For Germany, the challenge was to avoid humiliation while demonstrating that it could not be ignored. By February 1906, as sessions dragged on, it was increasingly apparent that the momentum favored France and Britain. The joint policing scheme with Spain gained traction. Financial reforms were discussed in terms that gave France disproportionate influence. The principle of Moroccan sovereignty was upheld in words but diluted in practice. Germany's insistence on strict internationalization found few backers. The gamble that France would stand isolated had failed to materialize. Instead, the outlines of Germany's isolation were becoming clearer with every debate. The opening weeks of the conference thus set the tone for what was to come. Algeciras was less a negotiation over technicalities than a referendum on Germany's place in Europe. The stage had been set in Tangier, and now in the halls of Andalusia the verdict was beginning to emerge. Although Edward VII never set foot in Algeciras during the proceedings, his presence was felt in every debate. The Anglo-French solidarity that underpinned France's confidence at the conference was the direct fruit of his personal diplomacy over the preceding 3 years. In the eyes of German observers, Edward was the architect of the web of encirclement that threatened to hem Germany in. In the eyes of French delegates, he was the guarantor that Paris would not face Berlin alone. His role illustrated how personal diplomacy, often overlooked in an age dominated by formal treaties and general staffs, could shape the course of international politics. Edward's influence stemmed from both his actions before the conference and the quiet but decisive signals emanating from London during it. His visit to Paris in 1903, with its public warmth and private assurances, had transformed Anglo-French relations from centuries of antagonism into what contemporaries quickly called cordial. He was not naive about the depth of old rivalries, but he understood that Britain's security depended upon cooperation with France. Without that personal groundwork, the British Foreign Office might have hesitated to tie itself too closely to French ambitions in Morocco. By the time the crisis erupted, however, Edward had already established a foundation of trust that endured despite the humiliation of Delcassés' resignation. At Algeciras, this foundation translated into practical solidarity. French delegates knew that Britain's representatives would echo their arguments, reinforcing them with maritime logic. When Cambon defended French policing rights, British officials added that divided responsibility in Morocco would undermine order and endanger Mediterranean trade. These arguments carried weight not simply because of their content, but because they reflected Anglo-French unity. The spectacle of two historic rivals now speaking in harmony was itself persuasive to neutral states, which hesitated to align with Germany against such a bloc. Behind the scenes, Edward used correspondence and trusted intermediaries to reinforce this solidarity. Letters to President Émile Loubet and private messages to French ministers conveyed encouragement at critical moments, reminding them that Britain's backing was not conditional but sustained. He also communicated with his own government, urging Grey to hold firm and warning against any temptation to compromise excessively for the sake of expediency. His reputation as an active monarch, willing to press his views, lent weight to these interventions. For Germany, Edward's role was deeply frustrating. Wilhelm II, who regarded his uncle with suspicion, believed the king had orchestrated the Entente precisely to contain Germany. In Berlin, newspapers mocked Edward as the peacemaker of Europe, with heavy irony, suggesting that his web of diplomacy was in fact a conspiracy against German freedom of action. To many in the Reichstag, the image of Britain siding with France in a colonial dispute confirmed that encirclement was no mere fantasy. This perception would have profound consequences for German policy in the years that followed. Within the conference hall, Edward's absence was paradoxically a kind of presence. Delegates from smaller states, aware of his reputation for personal charm and informal persuasion, assumed that his influence lay behind Britain's steadfastness. When Portugal and Belgium leaned toward the French position, it was widely believed that British encouragement had shaped their decisions. When the United States tilted in the same direction, commentators attributed it in part to Anglo-American sympathy fostered during Edward's reign. Though overstated, these assumptions reinforced the sense that Britain's monarch was the hidden hand guiding the negotiations. The weight of Edward's diplomacy also lay in credibility. For decades, Britain had cultivated the image of aloofness, avoiding permanent commitments on the continent. Foreign chancelleries had grown accustomed to regarding London's pledges as cautious and conditional. Edward's persistence in cultivating France altered that perception. By 1906, the conviction in Paris was that Britain's king himself was invested in the Entente, making it more than a passing alignment of officials. That credibility, projected into the halls of Algeciras, emboldened the French delegation to resist German pressure. At the same time, Edward was careful not to overplay his hand. He avoided inflammatory public statements, recognizing that Britain's role was strongest when it appeared measured. The image projected was not of a partisan monarch egging on France, but of a statesman safeguarding European balance. This moderation made Britain's support all the more persuasive. While Germany appeared strident and isolated, Britain and France appeared calm, rational, and united. Neutral states gravitated toward the latter, sensing where the balance of reason and power lay. The significance of Edward's influence was not lost on contemporaries. In French newspapers, editorials praised him as the moral ally of France, whose presence assured that Germany's challenge would not go unanswered. In Britain, commentators emphasized that the Entente had passed its first great test, thanks in part to the king's foresight. In Germany, criticism of Edward hardened into resentment, cementing the belief that Britain had abandoned its isolation to become France's partner in encirclement. The legacy of Algeciras, therefore, was not only the settlement of Moroccan reforms, but the confirmation of Edward VI's role as a central figure in European diplomacy. The immediate effect within the conference was to consolidate blocs. France, Britain, Spain, and Italy increasingly coordinated their positions, while the United States provided sympathetic reinforcement. Germany found itself supported only by Austria-Hungary, whose influence was limited. The weight of numbers and the weight of credibility lay against Berlin. That outcome was not foreordained. Without Britain's firm alignment, France might have found itself cornered. It was Edward's diplomacy that ensured otherwise. Thus, while Edward VII never appeared in Algeciras, the conference bore his imprint. His cultivation of alliances, his steady communication with French leaders, and his insistence on solidarity transformed the Moroccan crisis from a test of French isolation into a demonstration of Anglo-French strength. The Moroccan Sultan, still nominally sovereign, was a spectator to his own fate. Germany, having sought to divide, now found itself isolated. Edward's influence, discreet yet decisive, had tipped the balance. By the middle stages of the Algeciras Conference, Germany's predicament was becoming undeniable. What had begun as an assertive demonstration of Berlin's indispensability to world politics had devolved into a spectacle of its isolation. The very forum that von Bülow and Wilhelm II had demanded, an international gathering to adjudicate Morocco's future, now revealed how few friends Germany could command when confronted with the weight of Anglo-French solidarity. The erosion of German influence unfolded gradually in debates that on the surface concerned technical matters: policing, customs control, and financial supervision. But beneath these topics lay the larger question of prestige. Each state's position signaled not merely an opinion on Moroccan reforms, but an alignment in the wider contest between Germany and the Entente. In this arena, German delegates increasingly found themselves marginalized. Count von Tattenbach, Germany's chief representative, opened the conference with confident assertions of the need for international control. He argued that Moroccan sovereignty would be undermined if France alone supervised reforms, and he appealed to principles of equal commercial access. Yet his tone soon hardened into stridency. When delegates from Belgium or Portugal suggested compromise solutions, von Tattenbach rejected them out of hand, insisting on rigid formulations that reflected Berlin's maximal demands. This rigidity contrasted sharply with the measured diplomacy of Cambon and his British counterparts, who presented France's claims as pragmatic rather than dogmatic. The effect was cumulative. Neutral states, initially inclined to hear Germany's arguments, grew wary of its intransigence. Belgium, with extensive economic ties to France, tilted toward Paris's position. Portugal, bound to Britain by centuries-old alliance, naturally echoed London. Even Italy, formerly a member of the Triple Alliance, hesitated to offer Berlin unqualified support. Italian diplomats reminded their German colleagues that Rome had its own ambitions in Tripolitania and could ill afford to alienate France completely. The Italian press, reflecting public ambivalence, suggested that the Moroccan quarrel was of little interest to Italian taxpayers. Austria-Hungary remained Germany's one consistent partner, but its weight was limited. Count Galachowski's delegates faithfully echoed German positions, but other states recognized that Vienna's motives were rooted in loyalty to the alliance rather than conviction. The Habsburg monarchy, preoccupied with Balkan instability and internal national divisions, could add little gravitas to Germany's claims. Indeed, the sight of Germany and Austria-Hungary standing together, opposed to nearly the entire rest of Europe, only highlighted the imbalance. Russia, weakened by the 1905 revolution, sent a delegation but played a passive role. St. Petersburg had little capacity to influence the proceedings, yet even in its diminished state it offered no comfort to Germany. Russian delegates signaled tacit sympathy with France, a reminder that the Franco-Russian alliance, though shaken, remained alive. This further narrowed Germany's field of potential allies. The United States, whose role was modest but symbolically important, also leaned toward France. Ambassador Henry White, acting on instructions from President Theodore Roosevelt, emphasized the principle of fairness and non-exclusion in commerce. But in practice, Washington had no desire to see Germany destabilize the balance of power. The United States valued stability in the Mediterranean, where American trade was growing, and it viewed France as the responsible guarantor. White's interventions, while couched in neutral language, consistently reinforced Anglo-French proposals. Thus, by late February, the conference chamber reflected the stark division. Germany and Austria-Hungary on one side, virtually all other states on the other. The reality of isolation became clear in the press reports filed daily from Algeciras. German newspapers, once jubilant about forcing a conference, now expressed indignation that their delegates were being ganged up on by an Anglo-French coalition. In Paris, by contrast, the tone was triumphant. France, backed by Britain, was successfully resisting German bullying. London papers emphasized the growing solidarity of the Entente and portrayed Germany as reckless in its pursuit of prestige. Inside Germany, the perception of isolation provoked both anger and anxiety. In the Reichstag, Social Democratic deputies denounced the government for pursuing a policy that risked humiliation abroad while neglecting social reforms at home. Conservatives, while supporting the Kaiser, lamented the lack of effective allies. Von Bülow attempted to frame the situation as proof of Germany's moral stand against encirclement, but the underlying weakness was difficult to disguise. The humiliation lay not only in numbers but in the loss of credibility. Germany had insisted on a conference precisely to demonstrate that France could not act without Berlin's consent. Yet the proceedings showed the opposite, that when France and Britain stood together, Germany's voice could be drowned out by the weight of international opinion. Neutral states, instead of being drawn into Berlin's orbit, gravitated toward the Entente. The attempt to expose Anglo-French fragility had instead exposed Germany's diplomatic isolation. The consequences extended beyond Algeciras. Military planners in Berlin took note of the experience, concluding that Germany could not rely on diplomacy alone to secure its interests. The Schlieffen Plan, already in gestation, acquired greater urgency. If allies could not be guaranteed, then Germany must prepare for decisive military solutions. Meanwhile, in Paris and London, the lesson was equally clear. Solidarity had worked. By standing firm together, they had faced down German pressure without resorting to arms. For Sultan Abdelaziz's representatives, the spectacle was almost surreal. Their pleas for genuine Moroccan sovereignty were politely acknowledged, but carried little consequence. The real drama lay in the alignments of great powers. They observed, as all did, that Germany's isolation was the defining feature of the conference. For the Sultan, this meant that French predominance was all but assured. The longer the sessions continued, the clearer the verdict became. Germany, having overplayed its hand, was unable to recover momentum. Its demands for full internationalization found little support. France's claims, bolstered by Britain and Spain, appeared increasingly moderate in contrast. Each passing week underscored the narrowing of Germany's options: accept compromise or face humiliation. By the time the final stages of negotiation approached, the Moroccan crisis had already produced its political effect. Germany had sought to weaken the Entente Cordiale. Instead, it had strengthened it. It had sought to demonstrate indispensability. Instead, it revealed isolation. The international system of Europe had been tested, and the lines of division had hardened more clearly than before. By March 1906, the Algeciras Conference moved from confrontation to conclusion. After weeks of debate, drafting committees, and diplomatic maneuver, the outlines of the settlement came into view. What had begun as a bold German attempt to reassert influence ended in a compromise that, while saving appearances for Berlin, left France in practical control of Morocco. The settlement was as much about perception as substance, but in both respects the verdict was clear. Germany had lost the contest it had provoked. The most contentious issue, policing, was settled by a formula that disguised French predominance beneath the veil of international cooperation. Morocco's ports, particularly Casablanca and Tangier, were recognized as needing reliable order. German delegates demanded an international force composed of officers from multiple powers, arguing that anything less would create a de facto protectorate. France countered that only its forces, experienced in North African conditions and contiguous with Algeria, could guarantee security. The compromise, hammered out after protracted negotiation, stipulated that Moroccan police would be trained by French and Spanish officers, operating under nominal Moroccan command. Spain's inclusion provided the fig leaf of balance, but in practice France assumed the leading role. Financial reform offered another opportunity for France to consolidate influence. Morocco's treasury, long burdened by debt, required international oversight. Germany pressed for neutral control, hoping to dilute French leverage. Yet the final arrangement placed Moroccan customs revenues under the supervision of a state bank, modeled on European institutions but dominated by French capital. While German and other foreign investors received token participation, France emerged with decisive control over Moroccan finances. The symbolism was unmistakable. Sovereignty was upheld in principle, but economic dependence deepened in practice. The principle of Moroccan independence, much invoked throughout the conference, was formally affirmed in the final act. Delegates pledged respect for the Sultan's sovereignty and territorial integrity, echoing language familiar from other episodes of European colonial diplomacy. But the gap between words and reality was evident to all. Abdelaziz remained on the throne, yet his power was circumscribed by the new structures. Police trained by foreign officers, revenues supervised by an international bank, and reforms overseen by foreign advisors. What was presented as preservation of independence amounted to a carefully managed subordination to French tutelage. Germany, recognizing its isolation, accepted these terms reluctantly. Von Tattenbach secured minor concessions to preserve a semblance of dignity. The bank was nominally international, Spanish participation in policing was guaranteed, and commercial equality was affirmed. But these clauses could not conceal the outcome. France, with Britain's backing, had achieved recognition of its predominant role in Morocco. Germany had gained nothing of substance. The final act of Algeciras, signed in April 1906, thus confirmed the settlement. France was entrusted with the principal responsibility for maintaining order and supervising reform, supported by Spain in a secondary role. The Sultan's sovereignty was acknowledged, but under conditions that reduced it to symbolism. International commerce was guaranteed in principle, but French economic influence remained unrivaled. The bank, though international in structure, placed Morocco's financial system firmly under European, above all French, direction. In the press, reactions reflected national perspectives. In Paris, the outcome was celebrated as a diplomatic victory. Editorials declared that French prestige had been upheld and that Germany's attempt to humiliate France had backfired. British newspapers echoed this sentiment, emphasizing that Anglo-French solidarity had been vindicated. In Berlin, the tone was defensive. Officials presented the settlement as a balanced compromise that had preserved Moroccan independence, but few were convinced. The broader public understood that Germany had been isolated and that its demands had been largely ignored. The perception of humiliation was reinforced by the contrast between Germany's ambitions and the outcome. Wilhelm II had expected the conference to expose Anglo-French weakness. Instead, it exposed Germany's lack of allies. Von Bülow had hoped to fracture the Entente Cordiale. Instead, he had strengthened it. The diplomatic theater of Algeciras ended with Germany not as the arbiter of Europe, but as the outcast. For Morocco, the settlement deepened dependence. Sultan Abdelaziz could claim that his sovereignty had been preserved, but in practice his autonomy was curtailed further. The symbolism of international recognition did little to shield him from domestic challenges. Tribal revolts continued, fueled in part by resentment of foreign intrusion. The Moroccan population, largely excluded from the diplomatic proceedings, experienced the consequences of reforms imposed from abroad. New taxes, new policing arrangements, and increasing European involvement in commerce and administration. Spain, though cast in a supporting role, regarded the outcome as satisfactory. Its officers would share in policing, and its historic connection to northern Morocco was acknowledged. Italy, having hedged its position throughout, claimed credit for moderation. Austria-Hungary remained loyal to Germany but gained nothing. The United States, pleased to have participated in the settlement of a major European dispute, withdrew with its reputation for impartiality intact. The long-term consequences, however, extended beyond Morocco. Algeciras hardened the division of Europe into opposing blocs. France and Britain emerged with renewed confidence in their entente, convinced that solidarity had preserved their position. Germany, though still powerful, was more conscious than ever of encirclement. The diplomatic defeat sharpened the sense of vulnerability in Berlin, fueling the belief that only military preparedness could secure Germany's place. Thus, the settlement of Algeciras was more than a colonial arrangement. It was a moment of revelation. The balance of power had been tested not on the battlefield, but at the conference table, and the outcome was decisive. France had retained Morocco, Britain had confirmed its new role as a continental partner, and Germany had suffered a humiliation that would shape its policies in the years ahead. The Moroccan crisis was formally resolved, but its political reverberations were only beginning. The Algeciras settlement of 1906 resolved the immediate crisis, but its deeper legacy lay in how it altered the strategic calculations of Europe's powers. On the surface, the agreement appeared to maintain peace, preventing escalation into war. In reality, it hardened the divisions that had been forming since the turn of the century. The Moroccan quarrel, though colonial in appearance, had revealed the contours of the alliances that would define the continent until 1914. For France, the outcome was a vindication. The humiliation of Delcassés' resignation had threatened to expose weakness, but by the end of the conference, France emerged confirmed as Morocco's leading power. The role of Britain had been decisive. French leaders understood that without British solidarity, Paris might have been forced to yield further to Germany. The conclusion was unmistakable. The Entente Cordiale was not a paper accord, but a real partnership capable of resisting German pressure. In the years following Algeciras, French diplomacy leaned more heavily on Britain, not only in colonial matters but in European security. Military conversations between the two staffs, tentative before 1906, began to acquire greater substance. Though no formal alliance was signed, contingency planning for cooperation against Germany advanced steadily. Britain, for its part, had crossed a threshold. The Moroccan crisis was the first time in decades that London had committed itself so clearly to supporting a continental power in a dispute with Germany. The decision reflected not only Edward VI's diplomacy, but also the logic of strategy. Gibraltar, the Mediterranean, and the Channel were safer with France as a partner rather than as a rival. After Algeciras, Britain no longer regarded France as an adversary, but as an indispensable collaborator. This shift had profound consequences for the Royal Navy's deployments. With confidence in French friendship, the Admiralty could concentrate the main fleet in home waters against the rising challenge of the German Navy. Germany drew very different lessons. The experience at Algeciras convinced many in Berlin that diplomatic isolation was a structural reality, not a temporary setback. The Entente Cordiale had withstood its first test, and neutral powers had shown little inclination to support German initiatives. For Wilhelm II and von Bülow, the humiliation confirmed the narrative of Einkreisung, encirclement. If Britain, France, and Russia could coordinate, Germany risked facing a hostile coalition of superior numbers. The implication was stark. Diplomacy could no longer guarantee security. Only military strength could. The German General Staff absorbed these lessons with particular urgency. Alfred von Schlieffen, chief of the General Staff, had long argued that Germany's geographic position required rapid, decisive action in the event of war. The failure of diplomacy at Algeciras reinforced his conviction. If Germany could not rely on allies, it must prepare to fight a two-front war by knocking out France quickly before turning to Russia. The famous Schlieffen Plan, refined in the years immediately after 1906, was shaped by the perception of isolation born of the Moroccan crisis. Austria-Hungary's role in the crisis also had lasting effects. By supporting Germany at Algeciras, the dual monarchy reaffirmed its dependence on Berlin. Yet the commitment revealed the weakness of Vienna's position. Austria-Hungary had contributed nothing substantive to the outcome and had gained no rewards. Its alliance with Germany was increasingly one of necessity rather than choice. For other powers, the sight of Austria loyally echoing Germany without influence reinforced the impression that Berlin was effectively alone. Italy's equivocation was equally instructive. Though formally allied to Germany and Austria under the Triple Alliance, Italy had avoided strong alignment with Berlin. Its interests in North Africa, especially Libya, pointed toward eventual confrontation with the Ottoman Empire rather than involvement in Morocco. The ambivalence displayed at Algeciras foreshadowed Italy's later decision in 1914 to remain neutral despite treaty commitments. Russia, though too weakened in 1905-06 to play a decisive role, drew encouragement from the outcome. The Franco-Russian alliance, battered by the revolution and the defeat by Japan, survived intact. The alignment of France and Britain suggested to St. Petersburg that a broader coalition against Germany was possible. In the years after 1906, as Russia recovered internally, cooperation with both Paris and London deepened. By 1907, the Anglo-Russian Convention formally aligned Britain and Russia in Asia, completing the triangle of the Triple Entente. In this sense, Algeciras was a stepping stone toward the crystallization of the very encirclement Germany feared. For the smaller powers, the Moroccan crisis clarified the distribution of influence. Belgium, Portugal, and the Netherlands, all present at Algeciras, understood that their security lay in aligning with Britain and France rather than attempting neutrality between rival blocs. Spain, though granted a role in Moroccan policing, recognized its subordinate position but accepted it as preferable to confrontation with stronger neighbors. Even the United States, whose involvement was marginal, found itself instinctively closer to Britain and France, setting a precedent for later alignments. The intangible but profound consequence of Algeciras was the shift in atmosphere across Europe. Trust between Germany and its rivals diminished further. In Paris and London, German diplomacy was interpreted as reckless brinkmanship, willing to endanger peace for prestige. In Berlin, the refusal of other powers to support German claims confirmed suspicions of conspiracy. Mutual suspicion hardened, and the possibility of reconciliation receded. The Moroccan crisis also demonstrated the growing importance of public opinion in international affairs. Newspapers across Europe had followed the conference closely, framing it as a contest of national honor. French readers celebrated the defense of prestige, German readers lamented betrayal, and British readers applauded solidarity. Diplomats could no longer ignore the pressures of mass politics, and governments recognized that prestige was inseparable from security. In sum, the consequences of Algeciras reached far beyond Morocco. The conference entrenched the Anglo-French Entente, encouraged Russia's gradual recovery into an anti-German coalition, and deepened Berlin's conviction of encirclement. Military planning across Europe adjusted accordingly, with Germany refining its war plans and France and Britain beginning to contemplate real cooperation. The balance of power, once fluid, now solidified into two camps. The peace of 1906 was maintained, but it was a peace built on sharpened divisions. The Moroccan crisis had ended, but the path toward the greater conflagration of 1914 had been made straighter and clearer. When the delegates left Algeciras in April 1906, the Moroccan crisis appeared to be resolved, but its legacy outlasted the technical settlement. The outcome was remembered less for the clauses of the final act than for what it revealed about the structure of power in Europe. The crisis had begun as a colonial quarrel on the margins of the Mediterranean. It ended as a rehearsal for the rival blocs that would march to war 8 years later. For Germany, the memory of humiliation became a recurring theme in both political discourse and historical judgment. Wilhelm II and Chancellor von Bülow attempted to portray the result as a balanced compromise, claiming that Germany had secured recognition of Morocco's sovereignty and equality of commerce. Yet few in Berlin were convinced. The Reichstag debated the crisis with bitterness, opposition deputies accusing the government of reckless adventurism that had achieved nothing. Conservative voices defended the need to resist French expansion, but admitted that Germany's lack of allies had been laid bare. Among the military establishment, the conclusion was harsher. Diplomacy had proven inadequate, and Germany must rely on force if it was to secure its rightful place. The French, by contrast, remembered Algeciras as a turning point in national prestige. The fall of Delcasse had been a humiliation, but the outcome of the conference restored confidence. France had not only preserved its ambitions in Morocco, but had done so with Britain's open support. The Entente, once doubted, was now tested and proven. In Paris, politicians spoke of Britain as a true partner. French newspapers hailed the outcome as a victory of patience and solidarity over German intimidation. The crisis deepened the resolve to cultivate military cooperation with Britain, culminating in staff talks and the quiet alignment of war planning in the years that followed. Britain's legacy from the Moroccan affair was equally decisive. The Edwardian monarchy and the Foreign Office regarded the Entente as validated. The crisis had demonstrated that Britain could defend its strategic interests in the Mediterranean by supporting France rather than competing with it. The Royal Navy's global deployments were reorganized accordingly, concentrating the main fleet at home while relying on French forces in the Mediterranean. This redistribution, made possible by Anglo-French trust, would become a cornerstone of British strategy by 1914. Edward VII himself was celebrated as the quiet architect of this shift, his personal diplomacy having borne fruit at a critical juncture. For Austria-Hungary, the crisis confirmed its dependence on Germany without enhancing its standing. Its loyalty at Algeciras gained no reward, underscoring the asymmetry of the alliance. Italy's hesitation foreshadowed the fragility of the Triple Alliance. Russia, though weak in 1906, drew encouragement from the sight of Germany's isolation. The prospect of joining Britain and France in a broader entente became increasingly attractive, leading directly to the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907. In this sense, Algeciras was not an endpoint, but a milestone in the crystallization of the Triple Entente. For Morocco itself, the legacy was grim. Sultan Abdelaziz remained on the throne, but the facade of sovereignty concealed growing dependence. The reforms imposed under the Algeciras Act, international policing, financial control, and foreign supervision, eroded the independence of the Moroccan. Popular discontent mounted as tribal revolts intensified, fueled by resentment of foreign intrusion and the burden of new taxes. Within a few years, Morocco would again become the object of international crisis, culminating in the Agadir Affair of 1911. The settlement of 1906, rather than stabilizing the country, set the stage for further instability. Historians have since judged the Moroccan crisis as a watershed in European diplomacy. It did not cause the First World War, but it illuminated the structural tensions that would eventually erupt. The German gamble at Tangier revealed both the ambition of Berlin's Weltpolitik and the limits of its execution. By seeking to break the Entente Cordiale, Germany instead strengthened it. By insisting on an international conference, Germany exposed its own isolation. The lesson drawn in Berlin was not moderation, but the conviction that only through military preparedness could Germany overcome the disadvantage of encirclement. The crisis also revealed the rising significance of prestige in international affairs. States measured their success not merely in territorial gains or financial concessions, but in the perception of strength and credibility. France, humiliated by Delcass's fall, regained stature by holding firm at Algeciras. Britain, long aloof from continental affairs, demonstrated that its word carried weight when backed by naval power and royal diplomacy. Germany, unable to convert its rhetoric into support, suffered a blow to its international standing. In the age of mass politics and an increasingly vocal press, such perceptions mattered as much as concrete concessions. In retrospect, Algeciras foreshadowed the dilemmas of the 20th century. It illustrated how crises on the periphery could draw in the center, transforming disputes in distant regions into tests of alliances and balance. It showed how personal diplomacy, embodied in Edward VII, could influence the alignments of states. It demonstrated how domestic politics, the fall of a French minister, the discontent of the German Reichstag, the unrest of Russian Revolution, intersected with international strategy. Most of all, it revealed how peace could be preserved in the short term by compromise, yet at the cost of hardening divisions in the long term. By 1914, when Europe slid into war, statesmen could look back to the Moroccan crisis as a rehearsal. The blocs formed then were the blocs that would face each other at the Marne and the Somme. The perceptions of encirclement, credibility, and prestige that had sharpened at Algeciras continued to shape decisions up to the July crisis. The legacy of 1905-06 was thus not the preservation of peace, but the preparation of its destruction. In sum, the first Moroccan crisis was a colonial quarrel that became a European reckoning. It humiliated Germany, validated the Entente, and accelerated the polarization of alliances. It left Morocco compromised, Europe divided, and the world closer to the abyss of general war. What appeared in 1906 as a diplomatic victory for peace was, in the longer arc of history, one more step toward the cataclysm of 1914.